Sometimes an empire collapses, and no one inside realizes it until the walls have already fallen. They continue believing in the permanence of their throne, even as the foundation crumbles beneath their feet. The United States of America exists within precisely such a delusion right now. For more than a century, Washington has maintained a peculiar relationship with its northern neighbor, a relationship built on assumptions so deeply embedded that they ceased to be questioned generations ago. Canada was always there, quiet, compliant, almost invisible. A backyard, a storage facility, a tap that opens when needed. Nobody imagined the tap could be turned off. Nobody calculated what happens when the quiet one chooses to speak. There exists within Washington's decision-making apparatus a belief system so entrenched that it functions as doctrine without ever being formally articulated. Canada has no other options. Canada needs America. Canada depends on the American market. Canada is militarily weak. Canada is geographically imprisoned. This reasoning rests not merely on economic data, but on a psychological sense of superiority that pervades every layer of American strategic thinking. The big always wins. The strong always dictates terms. The consumer holds power over the producer. But what if this formula reverses? What if the one who possesses raw materials holds the real power over the one who produces finished goods? During the final week of January, something shifted. The shift itself had begun long before, but the breaking point arrived now. An executive order emerged from the White House imposing a comprehensive 25% tariff. The target was clear. Bring Canada to the negotiating table, strip away its bargaining chips, reorganize resource management according to Washington's preferences. The assumption behind this maneuver was simple. Canada would protest first, then submit, then ultimately accept whatever conditions Washington demanded, because Canada has nowhere else to go. Or so they thought. But the response from Ottawa was not the kind anyone anticipated. Counter-tariffs came, but they were not sufficient. A deeper strategy was deployed. National security clauses, strategic reserve legislation, export licensing frameworks. These legal instruments were not merely theoretical. They were activated. And the result? The fundamental circulation system on which the American economy operates began experiencing damage within days. Certain valves closed. Certain rail schedules were suspended. Certain truck convoys began waiting at the border. And by the time the American system recognized what was happening, it was already too late. Now, let us pause and consider something. Energy independence has been a repeated mantra for years. America produces its own oil. The shale revolution occurred. The Permian Basin is gushing. Export numbers are high. So why does closing Canada's oil tap create panic? Because the issue is not quantity but quality. The oil coming from Texas is light and sweet. The massive refineries along the Gulf Coast were designed for heavy and sour crude. These refineries were constructed with tens of billions of dollars in investment. These facilities, marvels of chemical engineering, are optimized for a specific feedstock profile. If you feed them the wrong type of oil, efficiency drops. Production falters. Diesel becomes insufficient. Jet fuel hits bottlenecks. Canada sends nearly 4 million barrels of heavy crude oil south every single day. Without this oil, the system cannot function. Venezuela was closed by sanctions. Mexico's production declined. Only one major source remained, Canada. And now this source has become a strategic lever. But the story moves toward an even more interesting point. Because Canada finally completed a project that had been delayed for years. The Trans Mountain Pipeline was finished. A door to the Pacific opened. And China is waiting behind that door. The Beijing government is ready to purchase every barrel that Washington rejects. Tankers have already lined up. Canada is no longer forced to sell only southward. It can also sell eastward. This means the balance is changing. So, what is the situation in the Midwest? Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, The refineries in these states get 70% of their feedstock from Canada. 70%. If this ratio breaks, refineries stop. There are no pipelines to transport Texas oil northward. The infrastructure is built for south-north flow, not north-south. Within days, pump stations in Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis are running dry. This is not a price problem. This is a product absence problem. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve? It sits in the Gulf, not in the Midwest. And anyway, the reserve cannot replace 4 million barrels of heavy crude per day. This is mathematically impossible. The American public is no longer unaware of this situation. The first morning gas lines formed, social media exploded. Everyone started blaming each other. But the truth is, this crisis was predictable. You built a continental-scale energy system assuming the border did not exist. Now that the border has become a wall, the machine stops. Arrogance always ends this way. Let us set aside the energy issue. Let us go deeper. To the uranium question. America gets 20% of its electricity from nuclear power plants. This fleet of plants provides baseload power. When the wind stops, when the sun sets, nuclear continues operating. But here is where the problem begins. America does not produce uranium. It imports 95%. From where? Previously Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. But in 2024, Congress banned Russian uranium to punish Putin. It seemed logical. So what is the alternative? Canada. The Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan is the world's richest uranium deposit. The Cigar Lake and McArthur River mines extract the highest-grade uranium on the planet. Cameco Corporation keeps the American nuclear fleet operational. When the White House launched the trade war, it assumed nuclear fuel would be exempted. It was not. Ottawa designated uranium a national security asset. Export licenses were suspended. The Pentagon experienced shock. Nuclear power plants operate on 18 to 24-month fuel cycles. They do not have years of inventory sitting in parking lots. Some plants are scheduled for refueling this spring. If fuel does not arrive, they will have to power down. If 20% of grid capacity is lost as summer approaches, rolling blackouts could begin along the eastern seaboard. And you cannot make instant purchases from the uranium market. From mine to mill, from enrichment to fuel rod fabrication, years pass. Canada knows this. Washington is learning it now. The U.S. Department of Energy is currently scrambling to find alternative sources in Australia and Namibia. But logistics are not ready. Moreover, who do you think is buying up African supply? China. When you corner Canada, you push them toward your rivals. If Canadian uranium feeds Chinese reactors while American reactors cool down, this is no longer a trade dispute. This is strategic suicide. Energy moves you. Uranium warms you. But now we arrive at the next subject. Potash. You do not eat it, but without it, you cannot eat food. Potash is the K in NPK fertilizer. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. If you want to grow corn, soybeans, wheat at industrial scales, potash is essential. Plants become weak. Yields drop. Food supply collapses. The world has 3 main potash sources: Russia and Belarus. Under sanctions, unreliable, logistically problematic. Canada. Saskatchewan alone produces nearly 1/3 of the global supply. Everyone else, tiny amounts. But here is the key point. 85% of the potash used by American farmers comes from Canada. 85%. There is no backup. There are no massive potash mines in Iowa. When Trump imposed a 25% tariff on all Canadian minerals, he effectively placed a 25% tax on every bushel of corn grown in America. But Canada did not let us pay the tax. The trains stopped. Saskatchewan's premier, acting in coordination with the Prime Minister, cited supply chain instability and froze rail shipments southward. Now, spring planting season is approaching. Farmers in the Corn Belt are sitting on their tractors staring at empty barns. They need that fertilizer now. If it does not go into the ground in April, there is no crop in October. If Canada keeps potash north of the border for just 30 days, we miss the planting window. Yields could drop by 30 to 40%. Do you understand what this does to food prices? Corn feeds cattle. Soybeans feed chickens. The price of beef, chicken, milk, eggs, and bread doubles. The breakfast tax. A self-inflicted wound. Canada, meanwhile, is expecting a bumper harvest. They have enough fertilizer for their own fields. They can sell their surplus production to the world at record prices while American farmers go bankrupt. The irony is crushing. The tariffs were supposed to protect the American farmer from unfair competition. Instead, they deprived the American farmer of the one thing he needs to compete. For 100 years, the United States and Canada have lived like a married couple. Arguments occurred, but they slept in the same bed. The assumption in Washington was this: Canada cannot go anywhere else. Land connection only to America. Same culture. They are trapped. This might have been true in 1990. It is not true in 2026. The Canadian Trade Minister announced the Pacific Gateway Initiative. LNG terminals on the West Coast are being fast-tracked. Critical mineral exports are being redirected to Japan, South Korea, and, yes, China. The report from the Royal Bank of Canada calls this the Dependency Trap Exit Strategy. Canada is realizing that having 70% of trade dependent on the U.S. is a national security risk. They are willing to take a short-term recession to break that chain. This is the nightmare scenario for the Pentagon. We rely on Canada for NORAD. The radar stations that detect Russian missiles coming over the Arctic sight on Canadian soil. We rely on Canadian aluminum to build our F-35 fighter jets. Canada provides 70% of U.S. aluminum imports. We rely on Canadian steel for our tanks. If Canada decides to become neutral in the trade war, if they say we will trade equally with everyone, suddenly the U.S. defense industrial base has a gaping hole in it. We cannot build jets without their metal. We cannot fly them without their fuel. We cannot spot incoming missiles without their land. The USMCA has turned into a zombie. The free trade agreement is effectively suspended. We have returned to 1930s protectionism. But in the 1930s, the U.S. was self-sufficient. In 2026, the U.S. is a specialized economy that needs raw materials. And we just declared war on the supplier. So how does this end? It ends with a phone call. It ends with the President of the United States picking up the phone, calling Ottawa, and blinking. Because the mathematics are undeniable. We can hurt Canada. We can crush their GDP. We can cause a recession in Toronto. But Canada can stop our cars. They can starve our crops. They can turn off our lights. The pain tolerance of a resource-rich nation is always higher than the pain tolerance of a consumption-rich nation. Canadians can burn wood to stay warm and eat their own wheat. Americans cannot eat iPhones. This trade war has exposed the fragility of the American empire. We expanded our influence globally, but forgot to secure our own backyard. We treated our closest ally like a vassal state, and now we are paying the price. The "we don't need Canada" movement was a bluff. Canada called it. As markets open Monday, watch 3 tickers. Cameco for uranium, Nutrien for potash, Exxon for refining margins. If those stocks are moving, the crisis is deepening. We will likely see a temporary exemption announced from the White House within 48 hours. They will call it a goodwill gesture, but we will know the truth. They looked at the empty gas tanks in the Midwest and realized that in 2026, the map has not changed. Geography is destiny, and we are stuck with each other. But let us go even deeper into the aluminum crisis, because this is the specific trigger that terrifies the U.S. military. The headlines are usually about oil, but the invisible crisis is metal. Aluminum is congealed electricity. To make it, you need bauxite and massive amounts of cheap power to run the smelters. Canada has Quebec. Quebec has hydroelectric power. It is the perfect aluminum factory. Alcoa and Rio Tinto operate massive smelting facilities north of the border that feed the U.S. manufacturing sector. Ford F-150s, Tesla chassis, Boeing fuselages, SpaceX rockets, and the armor plating on Bradley fighting vehicles. They all run on Canadian aluminum. The U.S. produces a tiny fraction of what it consumes. Our electricity is too expensive. We shut down our smelters decades ago. When the tariffs hit, the just-in-time supply chain of the auto industry snapped. Ford has plants in Oakville, Canada, and Detroit, U.S. Parts cross the border 7 times before a car is finished. With a 25% tariff on each crossing, the profit margin vanished. Ford and GM have already announced temporary line suspensions. This means thousands of auto workers in Michigan, a key swing state, are being sent home. The UAW, United Auto Workers, is furious. They are marching on Washington, not Ottawa. They know this trade war is killing their jobs, but the defense angle is scarier. The Department of Defense issued a report in 2025 stating that secure access to Canadian aluminum is a prerequisite for national defense strategy. If we have to buy aluminum from the open market, we are competing with China, and Chinese aluminum is dirty, coal-fired, and hit with other sanctions. We have effectively sanctioned our only clean, secure source of the metal we need to build the weapons to fight the next war. This is the autarky delusion, the belief that America can do it all alone. We cannot. Not anymore. The supply chains are too deep. The integration is too complex. Trying to untangle the U.S. and Canadian economies is like trying to separate Siamese twins with a chainsaw. You might succeed, but you will kill the patient. And finally, let us touch the third rail. Water, the Great Lakes. We share them, but Canada controls the northern flow. For years, the arid southwest of the U.S. has been eyeing Canadian freshwater. Schemes to pipe water from Manitoba to Nevada. Canada has always said no. But in a trade war, no becomes a weapon. There are treaties governing the flow of the Columbia River. The Columbia River Treaty was up for renegotiation. If Canada decides to maximize reservoir levels on their side for hydropower needs, a plausible excuse. Water levels in Washington State and Oregon drop. The Grand Coulee Dam loses capacity. The Pacific Northwest, home to Amazon and Microsoft data centers, loses power. Water is the ultimate resource, and Canada has 20% of the world's fresh water. You can print money, but you cannot print water. What we are witnessing in real time is the unraveling of an assumption that held American foreign policy together for generations. The assumption was this: proximity equals dependency. Because Canada shares a border with us, because they speak our language, because their economy is integrated with ours, they have no choice but to comply with whatever we demand. This assumption was always fragile, but it was never tested. Now it is being tested, and it is failing catastrophically. Consider the psychology of this moment. For decades, American policymakers have operated under the belief that economic interdependence creates leverage for the larger economy. The logic seemed airtight. If Canada depends on us for 70% of their exports, then we hold all the cards. But this logic ignores a fundamental asymmetry. Yes, Canada depends on American consumers, but America depends on Canadian resources. And in any negotiation, the one who controls what the other side cannot replace holds the ultimate leverage. Consumers can shift. Markets can adjust. But you cannot replace 4 million barrels of heavy crude overnight. You cannot replace uranium supply chains that take years to build. You cannot replace potash deposits that exist in only 3 places on Earth. The strategic failure here is not just economic, it is conceptual. Washington confused interdependence with dominance. They believed that because Canada needed American markets, Canada would accept any terms. But interdependence cuts both ways. And when you push an interdependent partner too far, they do not collapse. They diversify. They find new partners. They weaponize the very dependencies you took for granted. This is what we are seeing now. Canada is not responding to American pressure by capitulating. They are responding by accelerating their strategic pivot away from American dependency. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is not just an oil project. It is a declaration of independence. It says, "We do not need to sell exclusively to you anymore." The Pacific Gateway Initiative is not just a trade policy. It is a fundamental reorientation of Canadian strategic thinking. It says, we will not remain trapped in a bilateral relationship where we have no leverage. And here is the truly dangerous part for American interests. Every step Canada takes to reduce dependency on the United States creates an opportunity for American adversaries. China is not just buying Canadian oil. They are building relationships. They are offering alternative markets. They are positioning themselves as the reliable partner that America used to be. This is how empires lose influence, not through military defeat, but through the slow erosion of relationships they took for granted. The aluminum situation perfectly encapsulates this dynamic. For years, Canada has been the secure, reliable supplier of a critical defense material. The relationship worked because it was mutually beneficial. Canada got access to American markets. America got guaranteed supply of a strategic resource. But when Washington decided to impose tariffs on that relationship, they did not just make Canadian aluminum more expensive. They made Canada question the entire premise of the partnership. If America is willing to weaponize trade policy even against its closest ally, even for materials critical to mutual defense, then what is the value of being America's ally? This is the question now being asked in Ottawa, in every provincial capital, in every boardroom of every major Canadian resource company. And the answer they are arriving at is sobering. There is no value in being the reliable partner if reliability is not reciprocated. Better to diversify. Better to build relationships with multiple partners. Better to accept short-term economic pain in exchange for long-term strategic autonomy. The water issue adds another layer of complexity. Water scarcity is the defining resource challenge of the 21st century. The American Southwest is experiencing mega-drought conditions. Aquifers are depleting. Reservoirs are at historic lows. And sitting just across the northern border is one of the largest concentrations of fresh water on the planet. For years, American water planners have quietly fantasized about accessing Canadian water. But Canada has consistently refused. Not because of economics, but because of sovereignty. Water is life. Control over water is control over the future. Now imagine this scenario playing out in the context of a trade war. Canada controls the flow of rivers that feed American hydroelectric dams. Canada controls reservoir levels that impact American water supplies. They have never weaponized this control because the relationship was stable. But stability is a choice. And choices change when the underlying assumptions change. If America is willing to embargo Canadian goods, why would Canada continue guaranteeing American water? If Washington treats Ottawa as an adversary in trade, why would Ottawa act as a partner in resource management? This is the cascade effect of breaking trust between interdependent nations. Once the norms of cooperation erode, every aspect of the relationship becomes potentially adversarial. And in a relationship where both sides have leverage but one side has more essential resources, the side with resources eventually wins the war of attrition. The final dimension worth examining is the domestic political impact within the United States. The architects of this tariff strategy assumed that American consumers would tolerate short-term price increases in exchange for long-term strategic advantage. But that assumption is collapsing. Gas lines in the Midwest are not abstract economic theory. They are real people unable to drive to work. Food price inflation is not a statistic. It is families unable to afford groceries. Factory closures in Michigan are not collateral damage. They are communities losing their economic foundation. And here is the political trap. The very constituencies that supported protectionist trade policy are the ones being hurt most severely. Midwestern farmers who voted for tariffs are now unable to plant crops because they lack fertilizer. Auto workers in swing states who supported bringing manufacturing back to America are being laid off because the supply chains have broken. Rural communities that depend on affordable energy are watching gas prices spike. The political coalition that made this trade war possible is being destroyed by its consequences. This creates an impossible situation for any administration. Backing down looks like weakness, but continuing the policy creates economic and political devastation. The only way out is through negotiation, but negotiation from a position of weakness. And this is precisely where Ottawa wants Washington: desperate, weakened, willing to make concessions. What we are witnessing is not just a trade dispute. It is a fundamental reordering of North American power dynamics. For a century, the assumption was that American power was so overwhelming that Canada had no choice but to accept a subordinate position. That assumption is being shattered. Canada is demonstrating that resource power, properly leveraged, can counterbalance market power. They are showing that a smaller economy with control over essential inputs can dictate terms to a larger economy dependent on those inputs. This is the lesson that will reverberate far beyond North America. Every resource-rich nation watching this conflict is learning the same lesson. If Canada can stand up to the United States, anyone can. If the world's longest undefended border can become a strategic choke point, then interdependence is not a guarantee of American influence. It is a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. The endgame remains uncertain, but the trajectory is clear. Either Washington backs down and accepts that Canada is a partner, not a subordinate, or the relationship fractures permanently. There is no middle ground. The bluff has been called. The cards are on the table. And for the first time in living memory, America is learning what it feels like to be on the wrong side of a resource war,